My special guest is Jocelyn Bonnie. At 23 years old, she's already accomplished an amazing amount in the sport of triathlon. She races internationally for the United States. She was an NCAA champion as an individual, and she led her team to 2 NCAA team titles. She was a 4-time All-American, and in 2016, she was ranked second in the U.S. in the junior elite age group for U.S. triathlon. It's a pleasure to speak with you, Jocelyn. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast.
Great to be with you. And I'm curious, what got you into the sport of triathlon?
So I was a big water polo player growing up. I grew up in Southern California where water polo is kind of the holy grail of all sports. But I broke my arm playing water polo when I was 12. And both of my parents are big triathletes. And when I broke my arm, they kind of got me into running. And I joined a local kids triathlon team that was combined with their local triathlon club. And I kind of never went back to water polo. I just fell in love with the sport through that and never looked back.
What was it that you found so appealing about triathlon?
I really like that there's 3 different sports. So you're never spending 20 hours a week swimming or running 80 miles a week or spending 20 hours on the bike. There's always something different. And there's always the unique challenge of trying to get better at 3 sports at the same time, which is just, it's never end. Like there's always a new challenge. There's always something different. You're never doing the same thing twice.
Yeah. And I imagine when you're, training for 3 different sports, you must do a fairly high volume of training, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, for sure. As I've gotten older, the goal is always to increase training volume, but you have to do it in a smart way. So when I was a junior, I probably only trained like 15 hours a week. When I was in college, you probably brought that up to like 17 to 20. In the last couple of years, I've been able to bring it up. I train sometimes closer to 30 hours a week, but I'm not quite old enough to sustain that level of training yet. So we'll do a couple of weeks at like close to 30 hours, then go down to closer to 23 hours for a couple of weeks and just cycle that. Because training volume is extremely important, but you also have to be able to absorb it. You can't just, working smarter is always better than working harder. So yeah. It's definitely a process to get up there in training volume, but in triathlon, it's one of the keys to success.
Right. And so you're alluding to this idea of recovery, I think, as well. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you balance that high training volume with recovery and rest.
So really, you only get better from the work that you can recover from. So you can train 30 hours a week every single week, but you're not going to get any better from it. You actually probably get worse because you have to, you don't get better from the work you do, you get better from recovering from it. So we take recovery as seriously as I take training. So I spend at least an hour a day in my Normatec boots. I have a Whoop, which tracks everything with my recovery, sleep, resting heart rate variability, sleep quality. It gives me my sleep needs every night. So I know, some nights I really only have to sleep like 9 hours. Some nights it's closer to 10. And it rates my recovery every day. And my coach gets it and will kind of tinker with my training plan based on that. Because if you can't just keep like drilling yourself into the ground, you have to be fresh sometimes to be able to hit your key workouts. So really recovery, nutrition, sleep, hydration is just as important as the actual work that you're doing.
Right. So it sounds, Jocelyn, like you really try to incorporate those metrics or that feedback that you get from the data into your training. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. I personally am not a huge data person. I've been doing this sport for long enough that I feel like I have a pretty good idea of how I feel. But as an elite athlete, there's also a big emotional component, and that you always do want to train more because you have to be an elite triathlete, you have to have a certain level of volume to your training. And so having that hard data, especially I really don't analyze the data that much. I leave that to my coach, and having a coach who analyzes that hard data every day kind of gives you a much better idea of what you should be doing versus what you feel like you should be doing.
Yeah. And it also sounds like you're very comprehensive. You mentioned in terms of your monitoring of recovery with rest and nutrition and sleep. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, we track all of that just the same as we would track training. So, sleep is the most important of the three. If you're not sleeping, you really shouldn't be training at a high level because your body's just not going to absorb it. You're just going to get hurt or burnt out or injured. So sleep is the number one priority. A lot of people tend to praise themselves when they wake up at 3:30 in the morning for a workout. And if that's what you have to do, I think that's amazing that some people have the willpower to do that. But I've kind of set up my life to where everything I do can revolve around training, not vice versa. And so I don't start training most days until between 8 and 9 a.m. just because I train much better if I can get 10 hours of sleep. And the best way to get 10 hours of sleep is to not wake up at 5 a.m. and train.
Yeah.
And then nutrition, it's kind of the same thing. Like you have to really nail your post-workout protein. You have to be properly fueled going into every session. Otherwise you're just working backwards. And especially when you're trying to have a high training volume, if you come out of your first workout of the day depleted and you have 3 more workouts to get through that day and another 4 the next day, you're starting 2 steps behind, and it just never turns out well when you do that. And you could say the same thing about hydration.
Right. I imagine in a sport like triathlon, there's a fair bit of pain.
Oh yeah.
Maybe you can describe pain and how you cope with it.
I would say the biggest thing is fatigue, actually more than pain. So going through a hard workout when you're extremely fatigued is a learned skill. You kind of have to focus and more than anything and focus on one interval at a time, getting through one workout at a time. If you wake up at 7 in the morning and you realize that you still have a hard swim and then you have 3 more workouts and you're just exhausted in the first one, it's not going to do you any good to then the one after that and the one after that. The number one thing that I've learned is just to stay present in the workout. So the only thing you have to focus on is like the lap in front of you, really. If you get too far ahead of yourself, then you just worry unnecessarily. Like if you worry about how much the next workout's going to hurt, all it does is take away from the workout that you're in that moment.
Right. And how do you manage to stay present? Are there strategies that you use, Jocelyn, to keep yourself focused in the moment?
I would say more than anything, it's just practice. There's not like specific strategies that I use. I've just kind of realized through the years that you can, in triathlon especially, there's a lot of variables that you can stress about. Like you can be in the middle of a workout and stress about a workout 3 days from now that you know that you have to hit. And it's just it's not productive for your mental health or for your physical health. And all that it does is it messes up the 12 workouts in between the one that you're in and the one you're stressed about 3 days from now. Mm-hmm. So whenever I find myself kind of going into that mental place of, man, I have a time trial in 3 days, but this workout right now is just not feeling good. I'm in a lot of pain. I just kind of sit back and be like, okay, the only thing that matters right now is the lap in front of me or the mile in front of me. If I just focus on that and focus on being my best self right now, I'll probably be okay 3 days from now.
Yeah. So it seems like you have to kind of self-talk your way through some of these circumstances and give yourself messages almost in terms of what to focus in on.
Yeah. Being a professional triathlete, you spend an absurd amount of time in your head. So one of the most important things is to kind of make that a good place. Because if you're spending that many hours a week in your head and it's a negative place, you're not going to be in a very good spot. So you want to try to make it as positive as you can. And I mean, that's not saying that you don't have negative thoughts. Like I have plenty of them, but you just kind of, if you have a negative thought, you just kind of accept it and move on back to the positive. Try to have 3 positive for every 1 negative.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you put it, that you have an awful lot of time to be in your head. I imagine when you're, like going for a long run or bike session, that, the mind can wander to all kinds of things. So
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like, you've developed some strategies over the years to kind of keep yourself from stressing about all those things that you mentioned one could stress about.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you mentioned that when you were younger, you had injury as a water polo player, and I'm also aware that you've had a concussion somewhat recently. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what happened. How did you get the concussion?
So I've had quite a few injuries kind of through my career as a triathlete. And this one in particular has been just from start to finish, the craziest and kind of most unpredictable. So I've also had 5 stress fractures, and those ones are just very straightforward. You go to the doctor, they diagnose you, you have 6 weeks of no running, and in 6 weeks, you're probably fine to start running again. And it's very just cut and dry. You know why it happened. You know the injury recovery, you know how to recover, you do your physical therapy, and you come back and you're fine. This concussion was just the weirdest thing. I was at a training camp in St. George, Utah, and my team was doing an open water swimming drill. And when you swim open water in triathlon, it's a full contact sport. You pretty much swimming is on top of each other. There's arms flying everywhere. And I actually made it through the entire workout without a problem. Made it through the cool down. My team was sitting in the water. My coach was telling us something, and then we were done and we were swimming back to the wall. And when we were swimming back to the wall after the workout was done, one of my teammates breaststroke kicked, which is something that you never really do in triathlon. It's a big lateral motion. And I was off to his side, and he just breaststroke kicked me straight in the head. And at first I was like, oh, that hurt. But whatever, like you get hit in the head all the time in open water swimming, like just kind of part of it. So I kind of trained normally for a few days, and I definitely didn't feel right. I was like, man, like something just feels very off. I'm super tired, have these bad headaches, almost like migraines. And I told one of the, not one of our coaches, but one of the adults that was at the training camp, I was like, man, I almost feel a little concussed right now. And they told me, they're like, no, that's a very serious thing. Like, unless you actually have a concussion, like, don't say stuff like that. And I was like, you're probably right. Like, I just have a headache. I might be dehydrated. We're training hard. It's hot outside. The fatigue can affect you in different ways sometimes. And a couple of days later, we were doing a time trial, and I dove off one of the blocks, which is a very normal thing. And just the pressure of my head hitting the water, I just remember popping up and seeing stars. And then I don't remember anything for like an hour after that. And I think at that point I realized, like, okay, we've got more of a problem here.
Yeah. So initially after that training session, did you say anything to anyone at that time, or you waited a couple of days to report what you were experiencing?
Yeah. So I talked to my coach after that session, and I was like, yeah, like my head just kind of hurts, but I don't feel like I have a concussion, because at that point, light wasn't bothering me. Noise wasn't really bothering me. And I just had this really bad headache. And so we talked about it, and we decided that if the headache didn't go away in a few days, we would go to the doctor. And I definitely was not super upfront about how bad my head was hurting. I mean, I just kept calling it a headache, which is kind of like, I mean, lots of people get headaches, it's fine.
Yeah.
But it was hurting pretty significantly. I mean, if I could go back, I definitely would have probably been a little more upfront about exactly how much my head was hurting, and kind of that I was just feeling off and tired and like a little slowed down mentally. So that was definitely not one of my better moves. But at first it really wasn't that bad though. It kind of got a lot worse before it started getting a little better.
So, and I guess like, why did you kind of refer to it as a headache, or why, were you reluctant, it sounds, to indicate that it was maybe more severe?
So, I mean, I think that there was a large, as any athlete would say, there's a large sense of denial with it. I
Mm.
didn't want to be hurt. That the timing of it was just about as bad as it could have been. We were 3.5 weeks out from our first race in over a year because of COVID. We hadn't raced since March of 2020. And we finally had another race on the calendar. And I had just like dropped 20 seconds off my 500 free, which is like a huge amount of time. I my run was really healthy for the first time in like a year and a half. And like I was just feeling really confident going into these races about where my fitness was. And I was like, no, there is no way that something this stupid could derail my training, derail my racing. Like, this is fine. I'll tough my way through it. It's just a headache. It was kind of my original mindset.
Yeah.
And I think that mindset probably held my healing process more than it helped it, for sure. After a couple days, when I hit my head on the water again, I realized that we had a big issue that needed to be addressed. And at that point, my coach and I had a kind of heart to heart sit down and decided that we had to look at the long term here, not the short term. And I took pretty much a week off of training, 3 weeks out from a race, which is not what you want to be doing. But I just kind of took the mindset at that point that everyone in triathlon always says whatever it takes. And for me at that moment, whatever it takes meant taking a week off so my head could be healed enough to race. And I mean, unfortunately that didn't work, but at the time it was kind of the best guess on a treatment strategy.
Yeah. So I want to ask you more about what's happened since, but maybe you can just talk more, Jocelyn, about this motto of whatever it takes. Is that in terms of, does that mean whatever it takes to perform well or succeed, or what is that in reference to?
Yeah. So triathlon is kind of an all-consuming sport just because you have to be at an elite level in 3 different sports at the same time. So really whatever it takes is in reference to whatever it takes to succeed. And a lot of people hear whatever it takes and they think drilling yourself into the ground every single day in training, but that's really not what it means. It's whatever it takes to succeed. A lot of times means working smarter, not harder. So for me at that moment, whatever it takes meant taking a week off of training, which is a lot more mentally difficult than going through and completing a training block perfectly. Because at that moment, what it took for me to succeed was to let my head heal. And but sometimes whatever it takes means going through these really hard training sessions when you have a big layer of fatigue and just kind of getting through it and staying present. Sometimes it means sleeping 10 hours when you want to go hang out with your friends. Sometimes it means taking a workout off when your team when your team has a hard session because your recovery numbers are just really bad and you're not going to get anything from it. And sometimes it means going for a super long workout when you just really don't want to do it.
Yeah. So to kind of fall in almost to the trap of thinking that whatever it takes always means pushing yourself or doing more from what you're suggesting is not optimal or not necessarily the best way to approach that, your sport.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious also, you mentioned initially you spoke to an adult who was at the training camp, or it sounds like that was maybe a couple days after you had the concussion. Yeah. And they said, don't say you have a concussion, that's really serious. Is that right?
Yeah.
And when you told them about your headache, correct?
Yeah.
So what did you do then, or how did you respond when you got that feedback?
When I got that feedback, I was like, at that point I was kind of teetering with is this a problem or is this something that I should just work through? And then when I got that feedback, I was like, that was kind of the nail in the coffin almost to, all right, we just need to push through this. I'm racing in 3 weeks. I've put in so much over the last year for these races and I feel super ready to race. Like, let's just get through this. I can push through it. I can mentally get through it, which was not the way that I should have gone about it. Mm-hmm. That conversation was one, and it wasn't with anyone on our coaching staff. It was just an adult that happened to be around. And had I gone back, that conversation should have been with someone on our coaching staff, because it would have been a very, very different conversation.
Right.
But I also knew that if I had a conversation with someone on the coaching staff, where it would have gone. And at that point, I wasn't ready to accept that this was a big problem.
Right. So, and just to carry that a bit further, had you spoken to someone on the coaching staff, you mentioned you knew where it would go. Does that suggest that they would have followed up, or they would have sort of, asked you about what you were experiencing, or what are you suggesting?
Oh, definitely. They I'm very lucky that our coaching staff is incredible, and they would have taken me out of the training camp. And that is not what I wanted at that moment. That's probably what I needed, but that's not. I knew that was going to happen, and I wasn't ready to accept that yet.
Right. And so I guess at what point were you able to start accepting your circumstance?
For me, it happened about 3 days later when I hit my head on the water. I was almost in denial. Like, I didn't want to. I was fighting myself on if it was something that I should just tough out, because there are a lot of things in triathlon that you just have to tough out. Like, it's a tough sport, and you can get stuck in the trap of, am I being weak? Is this something that I need to just get through? And when I hit my head on the water 3 days later and was seeing stars and couldn't remember what happened, that's when I realized that this was a serious issue that I didn't need to just tough out. Like, this was a problem. And that's when my coach and I had a very serious conversation about it. And that's when we started taking more proactive action to help start to heal.
Right. And so what happened at that point? Maybe you can elaborate on what some of those next steps or proactive actions were.
Yeah. So the net of the conversation was that even though it was the most unideal timing and the most unideal situation I could have been in that moment, that what I needed to do was take time off of training to let my head heal. And that in the short term, a week off of training was not ideal. But in the long term, we trained 51 weeks a year, and taking a week off to let my head heal is just something that needed to happen. And that, if anything, a month later, I'd probably be grateful for it, because I would come back fresh mentally and physically. And so kind of the next step at that point was to take a few days off of training completely, and to go see a neurologist, and see what was really going on with my head, how serious of a problem it was, and what the neurologist thought. So that was on a Friday. The following Tuesday, I went to my first neurologist, and they told me basically that I was concussed, which I already knew. And then she told me that 90% of concussions heal within 4 weeks. And at that point, I was like, oh, this is great. Like, maybe I won't be able to race in 2 weeks, but there's a lot of races every year. That's okay. I can accept that. I'll come back from this in 4 weeks, and I'll be back to training just how I was before, and probably even better, because I'll have taken 4 weeks pretty down. So I'll be fresh going in, which is not something you get a lot as a triathlete. Right. So I was very hopeful at that point, and I was also very grateful. She gave me some very clear parameters on the protocol with concussion recovery. Now is not what they call the cocoon method, where you sit in a dark room until it's healed. Now there's a lot of research actually coming out that being active and staying up to date with your normal life can actually be more beneficial, as long as you do get enough dark, quiet time every day. So I was at about half of my normal training volume and none of my normal intensity, but I was pretty fine with that at that point. I was pretty confident that it was going to be a short-term thing, and that I was going to come back in like 3 weeks stronger. But unfortunately, that is not what ended up happening at all. And I actually still continued to get worse after that.
Maybe you can talk more about some of your symptoms and what's happened, what's caused it to be worse, I guess.
Yeah. So with brain injuries specifically, no one really knows why the 90% heal and the 10% don't. So I was in the 10%, and actually I ended up being able to keep a really good amount of fitness through those first 4 weeks. And at like 3.5 weeks, my coach and I decided that I was fit enough to race in these races that were our first in a year. And my neurologist cleared me to race, which I was super excited about. And I was definitely still had concussion symptoms. Like I was having really bad headaches at that point. And I was just not, I was really tired a lot. And I was pretty light sensitive, like bright lights for a long time would bother me. But my reaction time was back. I was past the time frame that second impact syndrome would be a problem. So my neurologist basically said if I were to crash in the race, it wouldn't be any worse than if I didn't have a concussion. And all of my testing showed that it was safe for me to race.
Right.
And I wasn't super race fit, but I was fit enough to race. So I went to Florida with my team to go and do these triathlons. And we were there I was there a week ahead, and they all raced in a race that first week that we were there that I chose not to do. Just, we wanted to give myself even one more week to completely heal. And so I sat that race out and just trained through it. And we were 3 days out from through that week, I started getting some new weird symptoms. Like I started zoning out a lot. Like we would be like at a team lunch or something, and I would just be staring out the window, just like completely zoned out in my own world. Or when I was in the middle of a workout, I stopped being able to talk in complete sentences, and I'd kind of stumble over my words a little bit and do stuff like that. And then it just kind of escalated from there throughout that week that we were in Florida before the race. And by the day before the race, I was going through these like hour-long times where I couldn't talk at all and I couldn't move. Like I was almost paralyzed for like an hour at a time. And so my coach ended up taking me to the emergency room the day before the race because we were talking to my neurologist, and they thought that I had I was having almost seizures when that was happening. So I went and got a head CT at an ER in Florida, and we were in the hospital until like 2 a.m. And it came back that there was nothing tragically wrong with my head. I had a clear head CT. And the doctors basically told us, like, there is something very wrong with your head right now, but it's nothing that is critical. Like, it's nothing that's going to kill you. And it's nothing that is like a really big problem. So we talked to my neurologist again, and she basically said, like, there's obviously something very wrong here, but there's nothing that's going to really, like, if you race, it's not going to be really bad. So I went and I raced, and halfway through the race, I had no idea where I was. And I actually stopped and talked to my coach during the running portion of the race. And I told him, I was like, I have no idea where I am right now. I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. And he told me, it's like, all right, just follow the orange cones until you get to the finish line. And I was like, okay, I can do that. But I forgot that I was supposed to run fast. So I just looked like I was out for an easy jog in the park in the middle of this professional triathlon. And I couldn't run in a straight line. So I kept like running into these cones. And when I finished, I was not in a good place. I had no idea where I was. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. And it was just this really weird thing because a week before that, the only real symptoms I was having was light sensitivity and like bad headaches. And now all of a sudden I was having these crazy symptoms just seemingly out of nowhere.
Yeah. So I guess initially, though, it's interesting. I guess you were cleared a week earlier, but it sounds like you were still having some symptoms, light sensitivity, headaches. How did that come to pass that you were cleared despite having those symptoms?
So really the mindset that the doctors and my coaches and I took was that if I were to race and I were to crash and I were to hit my head again, the doctors were very confident that me having a pre-existing concussion would not affect that. So if I were to crash again and hit my head again, it wouldn't be any worse to my head as if I hadn't had a concussion already.
Right.
And so we decided, like, I'm fit enough to race. We can get a good race experience here. There's nothing that's going to go critically wrong with my long-term health. because of this concussion in racing. So we might as well race. I mean, looking back, it seems kind of weird to say, but I really don't regret racing. It was not a pleasant experience, just from not being able to remember, but I did learn a lot through the process of racing under super, super unideal circumstances.
Yeah.
And how to mentally handle that, and how to be on the start line of a professional triathlon, knowing that my brain was not gonna function how it normally does, and that I wasn't as fit as I would have liked to be. Through that process, I learned a lot that is going to make me a better athlete in the future. And doing that race didn't set back my healing at all, and wasn't a risk to my long-term health. So it kind of ended up okay in the end, but it's definitely not how I had envisioned that race going a month before.
But also, Jocelyn, in the week before the race, you mentioned that you were having problems speaking, and that for hour-long periods, did you indicate that you had problems moving, or that you felt like paralyzed? So did you have concerns about that going into the race? Or?
So not specifically with that. So we kind of determined that it only happens when I'm at rest. So I had done a lot of testing through training, and we were very confident that it wouldn't happen while I was working out, especially in a very stimulating environment like a race. So my speech was definitely a little slurred. But that was the neurologist had told us that was just a sign of brain fatigue. So my brain was just like a little fatigued. I'd done reaction testing, so we knew my reaction time was at a level that was safe to compete at. And so we knew going in that post race, I was going to have some issues, but that it wasn't dangerous to my long-term health, and that it wouldn't happen during the race. And kind of my treatment team and my coaches and I were all very confident in that. And that was a big determining factor too, as to if I was going to race.
So how many weeks ago now was that race?
It was about a month ago.
And maybe you can talk about what's happened since, in terms of your symptoms, what you've been experiencing.
Yeah. So again, after that race, we were kind of told that I was 6 weeks post-concussion at that time, and that it would heal, and that no one really knew what my weird symptoms were caused by. The not being able to move and not being able to talk was it's kind of asymptomatic for concussions. It's not like completely unheard of, but it's also not a normal concussion symptom. So I went back to train in Salt Lake City, and I was pretty confident that I went to a new neurologist, and I was pretty confident that we were going to find some very easy solution, maybe take another week off of training, and that it would be better. And that has not quite happened. I found a new neurologist who figured out exactly what the problem was with my brain, which is that I have damage to the frontal lobe of my brain, which controls speech and motor function. So when my brain gets too fatigued through different activities, and then I sit down to rest, different parts of my brain just essentially start shutting off, which is why I get these really weird symptoms and feel like my brain just isn't working. And so the doctor, my new neurologist, gave me a whole set of like almost physical therapy exercises, and said, all right, if you do these 5 times a day, every day, you should be healed in the next 2 weeks. Like, these are pretty serious symptoms, but it's not from a super serious cause. It's just a very normal concussion. And so I went through the first 2 weeks. We were training at like half of my normal volume still. And just like in the mindset that, again, like whatever it takes, like I was going to do these exercises, that was going to be the priority, and I would be back to normal training 2 weeks later. And so I went back 2 weeks later to get retested, and all of my testing was worse. And it was one of those like hard pills to swallow again. Like, all right, I'm doing everything that these doctors are saying. I'm training at like half of my normal volume. I'm doing these exercises 5 times a day, and I'm getting worse. Like, why is this happening? Kind of the reality is that they didn't know why it wasn't healing. And that it just was going to take more time. And everyone is very confident that my brain is going to heal, but it's just a waiting game. So yeah.
What kind of exercises are you doing?
It's a lot that has to do with your vision. So it's practicing like looking at horizontal lines and vertical lines, and rhythm, like tapping your hands and your feet to a certain beat on a metronome, just to kind of rewire your brain connecting with your body.
Yeah. How have you managed the uncertainty of this whole experience?
So that's probably been the hardest part, is knowing that I'm going to heal, but just not knowing when. I've always had I've gone through a lot of injuries in the past, and every single injury I've ended up being grateful for, and it's made me better in some way. So I just really have gotten through it by keeping the faith that in some way, shape, or form, this whole experience is going to make me a better athlete in the long term. And for me, I'm still very young in triathlon, and this is a 10-year game, not a 10-month game. And somehow in a year from now, this is going to be the reason how I get to the next level. And there's a lot of times when it's really hard to see that, because you just see like, hey, my brain's not working. Everyone else is training and I'm not training. I'm falling behind and all this stuff. But you just have to like keep the faith that in some way, shape, or form, you're going to find a way to help you make this like work for you, not against you.
How do you think it will work for you, or how will it help you, do you think?
So it's actually been really interesting. I've trained at half or a third of my normal training volume for the last 10 weeks. And I did some testing in a swim workout a couple of days ago, and I had one of my best tests I've ever had. So I think that my body just needed some time off. I think I had been training at a pretty elite level for 8 of the last 10 years, since I was 16 years old. And I think that I just had a lot of layers of fatigue that I needed to peel away and kind of let the training sink in a little bit. I also found out through all of the brain testing that I was doing that I'd had a few other concussions in the past from different training accidents. And we found out that those concussions hadn't completely healed yet. And that there was a lot of symptoms from those concussions that were taking away from my training. Like I'd always really struggled with timing in my swim stroke and in my running form. And I found that through doing these exercises every day and completely healing both my concussion right now and my old concussions, that my form across all 3 strokes has drastically improved, even though I haven't really been training that much. And so even though I'm not super fit right now, my times are as good or better as they have been, just because of my improvements in my form and peeling away those extra layers of fatigue.
Right. So these multiple concussions have had a cumulative effect, and it sounds like that's impacted your technique, and just having the opportunity to recover a bit sounds like it's helping your technique.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something like I had no idea before we went and did all these testing for this concussion that I was having any symptoms from my other concussions still. I thought I was completely healed, completely back to normal, because they were all a couple of years ago. And I found out that wasn't the case. And it really, I mean, even though we had to take a few steps back in training, it's kind of forced me to create a better foundation than I had before, so that we can build upon my foundation better moving forward.
Yeah. So given what you just said, Jocelyn, that, you're finding out that even years after some of these initial concussions, that they still have had impact on you.
Yeah.
Looking back in retrospect now, when you got that information from the doctor that, or your initial neurologist, that 90% of concussions heal, or people with concussions heal within 4 weeks, was that helpful? Is that the kind of information that's useful for an athlete? I mean, you said initially it gave you hope, but I'm wondering, looking back now, was that helpful, more harmful?
To be honest, I think that for someone in the normal population, that's probably pretty accurate. But for someone that's trying to, like, it's going up against your genetic potential in athletics, I don't think that that's a very accurate statement. And I think that people tend to make that statement just because it's a super, super small portion of the population that would ever need to realize that their timing is slightly off in their swim stroke. So I think for the reality for most people is that, yeah, you're going to be fine after 4 weeks, and you're going to go back to life as normal, and everything's going to be just, you're going to be fine. And I think that the neurologist that I had originally saw probably just didn't understand elite athletics to a great degree. And so for me, the reality was that I wasn't going to be fine in 4 weeks. And I think that if we would have had that information that I wasn't going to be fine in 4 weeks, on week 2 of this, that things would have been very different in how my coach and I approached training and approached racing. If I would have known 9 weeks ago that I would be sitting at week 11 now and still not being able to train the way I wanted to, I would have completely shut everything down until I was completely fine. But the information we had from the doctors was that I was going to be completely fine in 4 weeks, that I could train pretty much how I wanted to, and it wasn't going to impact my healing, that I could race, and that it was going to be safe and fine to race. And looking back, that was not great advice. And if I would have been able to see 11 weeks into the future and seen that kind of what my 11 weeks looked like, I would have handled things very differently from the beginning. But at the same time, like, I did the best with the information that I had. And at the time, it was all things that was very hopeful, but it just wasn't accurate.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, you imply this idea of, getting the help from professionals who understand the specifics of elite sport.
Yeah.
But I also suppose there's a lot of individual variability with how people respond to concussion and unknowns.
Oh, for sure.
What are some things that you're thinking about at the moment in terms of your recovery and moving forward to getting back to your performance?
So, I mean, kind of the biggest thing that my coach and I are focusing on right now, and the only thing that really matters, is healing my head 100%. Everything else is kind of just a side note now. I have to stay in contact with the 3 sports multiple times a week. I mean, I'm still training 18 hours a week, so it's not like I'm sitting in a dark room all day, which my new neurologist, who works with a lot of elite athletes, is fully cleared and says is actually good for me. And I found it to be very helpful. But the things that we're focusing on mentally right now it's really just all about healing. That's the most important thing, because as much as it's hard not to worry about, like, that I should be racing again in 2 or 3 months and I need to start training again, doesn't matter how fit I am if I can't remember to run fast in a race, because my head's messed up. And I think that's a hard mindset it's a hard mindset shift, but it's one that needs to happen. And then also just being grateful for everything that we've learned through this struggle. Like, from what my neurologist said, I probably would have never figured out how to have correct timing with my swim stroke, just because my brain wasn't able to process it. And now that we've gone back and fixed some of these more fundamental issues, I have a greater upside potential now with both swimming and running, which is really promising news. And if you look at my career, like I said, this is a 10-year game, not a 10-month game. And over the course of 10 years, these 2 or maybe 3 months by the end of this off of training really aren't going to hurt me at all. If anything, I'll be fresher long term for the next 2 or 3 years, because I had this time where I wasn't going up against that gray area of overtraining versus undertraining every single day. So I think on a short-term basis, it's definitely not ideal, but on a long-term basis, it's going to be struggle that's going to really hopefully get me to the next level that I wasn't able to get to before.
Yeah. Would you say then that this injury has helped you or forced you to take more of a long-term perspective on your career?
Definitely. I mean, the way that I'm coached, thankfully, is a very long-term approach to sport. And so I think that we always kind of have that long-term perspective in what we do, but it's definitely more so now in that if you just look at the next 10, even 6 months, it's very, very like it's a hard pill to swallow because it's not what I would have liked at this time in my career. Like this is my last year racing as a under 23, which is kind of a subdivision of professionals where you have a different world championships because 23-year-olds and 33-year-olds are just very different. So as my last year as under 23, I wanted to make some big moves. And so far I haven't really been able to train. So it's really hard to look at the short term right now, but if you look at the long term, I find it super helpful to getting through kind of the rough view in the short term. So, and really nothing matters for me for the next 3 to 4 years of my career. All that matters is that we get there in 7 to 10 years. I think I think that I've had to learn how to step back every single day and not look at, all right, this day I didn't train as much as I wanted to, or as much as I think that I should have, but that's okay because that's what's going to make me better 8 years from now.
Yeah. You've alluded to this, but maybe you can talk a bit more specifically about how you've adjusted your goals, short-term or long-term.
Yeah. So short term, going into this season, actually like the day before I got my concussion, my coach and I sat down and set out some very specific goals that I wanted to hit this season. One of which was either was getting the win at under 23 national championships and at collegiate national championships, and to try to get that double this year. And, like as much as I still do have faith that that's possible for this season, it's at this point that race is 3 months away and I haven't been able to train at an elite level for 2 months. So that can't be the focus anymore. Whereas every day I would wake up and that would be the focus. Yeah. Now the focus just needs to be on healing my head and having faith that if I'm doing everything I can to heal my head, that everything else will just kind of fall into place.
Right.
So the goals have really shifted from athletic performance goals to the only thing that matters is making sure that my head is fully healed and that we're doing all these exercises to heal my past concussions at the same time to give me a greater ability to get faster in the future.
Yeah. What are some expectations, Jocelyn, that you have in terms of your sport medicine providers?
I think one of the biggest things that I've learned through this process actually is that I need to be very specific in working with sports providers that understand the unique demands of elite performance and elite competition. So I'm super the expectations that I have now are just that I need to be more specific in the providers that I choose and that they understand what I'm trying to accomplish is not going for and running a 5K fast. It's trying to go to the Olympics and reach as fast as I genetically can get, which is very different from even your top of the line high school athlete. Sure. And I need sports medicine providers that understand those unique demands, which is hard to find. But thankfully in Salt Lake City, there's a lot of elite athletes here. So there are those sports providers out there that really understand what's going on.
Yeah. And along those lines, in terms of support or assistance, what kinds of support have been or are important to you in your recovery?
I think that probably the most important thing through all of this is having a group of people around you to support you. Because it's not an easy process to go through. And I think having that inner circle of people around you that understand what you're going through and can help you through the trials is the most important thing. I'm very, very thankful that I have a coach and a team who really we all support each other through all the trials, and we all love each other like family, and we understand that this is an extremely hard sport and an extremely hard journey. And our coach tells us every single day that none of us can do it alone. If we try to do it alone, none of us are ever going to reach our goals. The only way we're going to reach our goals is if we work through it together. And I think that I'm super fortunate that we all take that to heart. And through every single trial that I've gone through with this, I have teammates and coaches and support around me through everything. And I don't think that I would have been able to get through it without that. And so I think that having that support network is so crucial. And they don't understand the specifics of what I'm going through probably, but they understand how hard it is to have such a big setback like this at an important part in your an important time in your season. And they really, I mean, I know that if I was having a hard day, there's 7 people that I could call that would all answer the call and help me through whatever I was going through. And I think that team culture is so important and so crucial. And also having a coach that my coach would never, I was the one that was pushing the race. My coach wasn't pushing the race. I never felt any sort of pressure from my coaches to train or race through this. They were always the ones that would be like, hey, like, we need to take a step back. We need to look at the long term here. Every mental skill that I've learned has been from my coaches, and I'm super fortunate that they haven't forced me to go back to training before I'm ready. It's quite the opposite. I'm usually the one pushing me, like, all right, like, I need to do this today. I need to do this today. And they're always, my coach is the first one to tell me to take a step back and look at this in a 10-year perspective, not a 10-day or 10-month perspective. And that in 10 years, I'm not going to be happy if I'm doing all these things that continually hurt my brain. But in 10 years, I am going to be happy that we took these steps back and that we created a better foundation. Yeah. So without those two things, I don't know how people could do it.
Right. Yeah, it's wonderful that you have that support around you, and also it sounds like encouragement just to take your time and to back off when needed, particularly from your coaches. How have your thoughts or emotions changed over the course of the last 10 weeks?
So at first, I was for the first few days, I was in denial. And I was kind of just teetering on, is this a problem? Is this not a problem? Is this something I should tough out? Is there something I shouldn't? And then I realized I did have a problem. And I had a very good talk with my coach when we realized I had a problem. And I kind of immediately went into the mindset that we're going to figure out a way for this to make me better. And I don't know what that is yet, but I have faith that we'll find out. And I don't need to know what it is right now. I just need to go through the process right now. And I was very hopeful. And I saw that first neurologist a few weeks later who told me that it would be healed in 4 weeks. And I was like, a 4-week problem is not the end of the world. We're going to get through this and we're going to be fine. When I started getting my new symptoms of not being able to talk and not being able to move when I was at rest, more than anything, that was a very scary situation for me. Like, not being able to move is a very terrifying feeling. And so I always kept that faith that this in some way was going to work for me, not against me, and that this was happening for me, not happening to me. But I was really scared. It was a really scary process. And yeah, that was the biggest emotion there. It was just, I was scared. I wasn't scared about my long-term future. I was scared about my present situation. Yeah. And then as I've kind of gotten used to that and got some answers from new doctors, I've kind of gotten back to the being hopeful that, and being both hopeful and grateful for this struggle, because I found a new way to get better, and I found more upward potential in my 3 sports, which is always, it's really hard when you've been doing this sport for 10 years to find big gains, and to find a big gain through this process is something that I'm super grateful for. Yeah. But that's not to say, like, there's been a lot of very hard days through that 11 weeks. So it's not like, and always like, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, man, my head really hurts. I'm super grateful for this right now. Like I'll wake up in the morning and my head pain will just be crazy, and I won't be able to go to practice with the team because I'm in too much pain. And those are very hard moments, but I've kind of learned to, in that moment, instead of trying to, at first I'd almost kind of get mad at myself that my mindset wasn't strong enough to not be upset by those hard moments. But I've kind of learned, just if I stay present in those hard moments, be like, this is really hard, this is really painful, this is upsetting, then it's pretty easy to move on from. Then an hour later, you're like, yeah, that was hard, that was upsetting, but listen, like I'm super grateful for how this is going to make me better in 10 years. And learning how to just stay present through those hard moments has been a really good lesson that I've learned through this process.
Yeah. So learning how to accept that it's all right, or it's normal to, to feel frustration or whatever emotions you may be experiencing through pain or difficulty. You mentioned that's helped you to get through those instances or to move forward.
Yeah. Just the rapid acceptance of your current situation. Like instead of fighting that you're upset about something, just being like, yeah, this is a very hard moment for me, and that's okay.
Yeah. You mentioned hope a number of times, Jocelyn. What does hope mean to you, and why, if at all, is it important in your recovery?
I think that hope to me means that like you're in a positive mental space with it. I think that if you're in a negative mental space and you don't have hope that things are going to get better, then it's really, really hard to get better from it, and you end up getting worse. So I feel like hope is kind of in the realm of positivity. And I feel like positivity through an injury is the only way you're going to improve through it. Like you kind of have two choices. You either drag your feet through the mud through the whole process, and it probably ends up taking longer, and you probably don't get better from it, or you can have hope that things are all going to work out. And the reality is, if you have that, you're probably going to heal faster, and you're probably going to find a way to get better from it. Yeah. And those are really your only two choices when you're faced with an injury. Like there's no third option.
What contributes to your sense of hopefulness?
So I went through a time like a year and a half ago where I had 5 stress fractures over the course of like a year and a half. And that was a very, very hard time because I didn't know why I kept getting stress fractures. I had really good bone density. I wasn't running that much. And it was just, that was a big trial for me. And at that point, I just kind of had I just decided that I could either be super negative about it or I could be really positive about it. And I kind of took this like dumbfounded positivity. Like there was no reason to be positive about it. I kept breaking my bones for seemingly no reason. But I feel like that positivity that I took through that trial was what helped me to get better from it. Yeah. And so when I hit this trial and when I first hurt my head, I just fell back from that. And I remembered, 2 years ago, like I went through another really hard thing, and just that unfounded positivity was what got me through. And I'm super grateful for that struggle now, because the same thing, it forced me to fix some problems with my foundation. And I've gotten like my upward potential in running is like insanely better now because of that struggle and because of that hard year and a half or 2 years. So I kind of had to take the same faith into this struggle, and that knowing that if I was positive through the whole thing, that I had a strong confidence that I was going to find a way for this to make me better. And I just knew that I wasn't going to know how this was going to make me better, probably until the tail end of the struggle. But I just had faith and had hope through the whole thing that positivity wasn't going to hurt. Like there was no negative that was going to come from being positive. Like maybe I get to the end and didn't find a huge way to make me better, which thankfully didn't happen, but there still was no negative to having faith and hope that it was going to make me better.
Right. You use that term unfounded positivity a couple of times. What do you mean by that?
Just that there was no reason through both of their struggles. There was no fact that I could fall back on to be positive through it. Mm-hmm. Like there's no guarantee that anything positive was going to come through it. And I just kind of decided that I had two options. I could be positive about it or I could be negative about it. And my quality of life was probably going to be a lot higher if I was positive and hopeful through the process than if I was negative and upset and dragging my feet. And so I just kind of chose to be positive and kind of chose to keep the faith and keep the hope, even when it seemed like things were really not hopeful.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've been through these stress fractures or your current situation, you've been intentional, it seems, about adopting a certain mindset or approach to recovery. Would that be an accurate statement?
Oh, for sure. I think that, I mean, one of the things that my team works on a lot with training is that you have to be in the right mindset over motivation, mindset over everything. You could be the fittest athlete in the world, but if you have a bad mindset, you're never going to be successful. So mental training and having the right mindset is just as important as your physical training. So training every day on how to have a good mindset is something that, and how to be intentional with your thoughts is something that we do. And it's something that we train for as hard as we train physically. So you're almost more, like, I've trained my brain to be very accepting of like these mindset shifts and being intentional with my thoughts, which is extremely helpful during trials like this.
Yeah. I have just a couple more questions for you, Jocelyn. How will you know when you're psychologically prepared, or even just forget about the psychological? How will you know when you're ready to compete again?
I think that the number one thing will be that I do a lot of very in-depth testing on my brain right now. And I think the number one thing will be that all of my tests are normal again, because that takes any subjective, anything, any emotion, any wants or needs out of the equation. That is very straightforward information. There's very clear cut standards to what a normal brain should look like. And there are very clear numbers to where I'm at right now. And I think that the number one thing will be when all of my numbers are normal, I will be back. I'll be able to go back to training and racing how I would like to. I think the second part of it is that there's a lot of, I've noticed this through my stress fractures too, is that when you're not ready to compete yet, and when you're not ready to train yet, there's a lot of fear. Like when I was developing my stress fractures, when I would see a run workout, there'd be a lot of fear, and it wouldn't be a fear of the workout. It would be a fear of the injury. And as I healed, you start getting excited to run instead of fearful to run. And I think that will be, it's very similar with my concussion right now. I'm very fearful to jump into a swimming lane with a lot of people because I don't want anyone to touch my head. I don't want anyone to hit my head. I don't want my head to be near any area that it could get hit. And I think that from a deep physiological level, once it's healed, I'll stop having that fear, just because that's kind of what I've learned with my stress fractures is I started getting excited again. Excited to run. And I feel like once I get excited to go back into open water swim practices, that will be another clear sign that I'm pretty healed up.
Yeah. So in addition to those physiological indicators or objective indicators that you mentioned, the emotions, it sounds, will play an important role in determining your readiness. You mentioned predominance of excitement relative to fear. And you also mentioned that, emotions or your wants, I guess, as an athlete can influence decisions. Would you say that can cloud one's judgment or influence one's judgment about whether they're ready or not?
Oh, 100%. I would have told you. So when I went back to get tested, all these tests on my brain the second time, we were walking in and I told my coach, I was like, I'm about to pass all these tests and I'm going to go back to full-time training, just because I wanted that so badly that it was clouding my judgment on if I was ready. And I went in and I failed every single test. Every single test was worse than it was before. And my judgment was so clouded by wanting to get back to training when I just was not ready for it yet. So having those clear, like, markers that are just so, that are so like objective, like there's no, you can't, like, you're either ready or you're not ready. So
Yeah.
to have those, like,
You can say
just
hi.
having those,
Is that your little
yeah.
brother in the background?
So just having those, yeah, having those numbers that say, yeah, you're ready to go back to training is what you need.
Yeah. My last question, what advice would you give to other concussed athletes, or maybe ones experiencing stress fracture, musculoskeletal injury? What advice would you give to other athletes going through, just even a fraction of the trials or tribulations you've experienced?
I would say the most important thing is to be in the mindset this is happening for you and not to you.
Mm.
You have two options. You can either be negative through it or you can be positive through it. And that just relentless positivity is what will get you through. Because you have to find a way to get better through your trials if you want to succeed in sport, because everyone's going to have trials. It's just a part of it. And the way to get better long term is to find a way to get better through the hard things that you go through. And the only way to do that is to have the faith and the confidence and the positivity that it will make you better. So, but staying in that mindset is a lot easier said than done. But I really think that is the key to success, both through injury prevention and through sport in the long term.
Yeah. And so when you say, Jocelyn, that an injury happens for you, I'm guessing that implies that there's benefits that one can derive, whereas the not to, it's not something that happens to you, suggests that you're a victim, or that
Exactly.
you're passive. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, that's exactly right. You want to try to stay as far as you can away from the victim mentality, because the victim mentality is never going to make you better. It's just you're just gonna feel bad for yourself. You're gonna have a pity party. You're gonna have all these negative emotions, and that's not gonna make you better. But if you're in the mindset that this is happening for you, then you're gonna find a way to improve through the trial. Just even by having that mindset, you're going to be looking, if you're looking for something, you're going to find it. So if you're looking for a way that this is going to make you better, you're going to find a way that it's going to make you better. It might not be like a huge thing. Maybe it's just that you're fresher. Maybe it's that you're mentally rested. I mean, even that goes such a long way. So as long as you're in the mindset that this is not happening to you, it's happening for you, you're going to be looking for the ways that it's going to make you improve, and you're going to find those ways.
Yeah. Jocelyn, I want to thank you so much for all of your thoughtful comments, but also just sharing your experiences very openly, candidly. I really feel like there's value in you sharing some of your experiences. And I know that, of course, there's other injured athletes who may go through some difficulties, and I'm sure that hearing some of your experiences can be helpful or a source of support to them. So thank you very much for taking the time. Again, I really appreciate the chance to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. This was awesome. I really appreciate it.